So it's a pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Daphne Miller.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's lovely to be back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Louisville. I'm so happy to be back here. So, in the past couple years, I've been plagued with dirty thoughts. Where's my advancer? I'm so excited to get out here. I sit there in my sterile 8x10 exam room, seeing patients, and all I can do is think about dirt, or soil, as farmers call it, and specifically how much it affects my patients' health without their even knowing it. I don't know if any of you have ever looked up the words health and soil in PubMed, in the great search engine for medicine. Anybody ever done that? Well, this is what you get back, at least for the first couple pages of your search. Words like radon, heavy metals, pesticides, pathogenic yeast, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, tetanus. If you were to read these studies on soil and health, you would say, wow, soil is a really dangerous place. But if you go to PubMed and you start to search further and you actually change your glasses a little bit and maybe even change the search words a little bit, all of a sudden, these other studies start to burble to the surface. And they're not ones that are telling you that soil is going to kill you. They're actually studies suggesting that soil, or particularly healthy soil, might be really great for your health. And these are the studies that started to catch my attention and make me wonder what I could start to learn from farmers about the connections between soil and health. So as I was wondering this, I had the good fortune of being invited to Louisville to speak at your Idea Festival about 3 years ago. And while I was here, I actually made a little trip up the 71 to visit this man. Is there anybody in this room who doesn't know this man? You're going to be embarrassed to admit it. Maybe some New Yorkers, I don't know. This is Wendell Berry, one of the treasures of this country and certainly of Kentucky. Farmer, poet, activist, essayist. What have I left out? So I sat with Wendell Berry on his porch. It was actually the day before the Idea Festival. I sat on this side over here. And we talked. And he said many things to me that day, many amazing things. And this is one of the things that he said that actually caught me the most. He said, when we mistreat our soil, we're drawing on natural capital that we cannot replace. We've done the same thing with our health. We stop listening to ourselves and submit to that equation, organism equals machine. Now, this, for me, is a very important idea. This idea that he's equating factory farming with factory medicine. It's something that I had actually been thinking about for a while, but not so much in those terms. And immediately, my next question was, if we have this factory form, this extractive form of medicine, is there a more sustainable form? And can I learn from sustainable farmers about what that would be? So from there, I truly set out on a journey around the country, and you're going to come with me this afternoon as I learn from these farmers. The first place I traveled was Washington State, to Jubilee Farms, and to these two. Someone got the joke right away. I love that t-shirt. Come on. You guys should all be laughing. What was in that lunch, anyway? Does anybody not get the joke? Okay. So I spent time with Eric and Wendy Hawkinson. And Eric, when he bought his land, he wasn't a farmer by inheritance. He was, new to the profession. And when he bought his land in the 90s, he wanted to grow fruits and vegetables with nutritional punch. But he didn't quite know how to do it, and the land was very depleted. So he went to the agronomy textbooks that taught him to take a very sort of reductionist or mechanistic approach to solving his bad soil problem. They told him to do something which is called test and replace, where you go around your land and you put your soil in test tubes, and you send it off to a lab, and then the lab will send you back a report and tell you what minerals are missing, and then you buy bags of minerals and you put them in the soil. Test and replace. So he did this for a couple years, but a couple things were really troubling him. First of all, he continued to send his soil to the labs, and the tests weren't coming back that much better. And his fruits and vegetables were not looking like these vibrant things that he'd hoped they would. And plus, on those bags, in little writing at the bottom of the bags, and by the way, this is to do organic farming, it said, "Please wear a mask while dispersing these." All of those things made Eric feel like there must be another way. So he turned away from test and replace and went to something that was much more holistic. He went back to the books, but this time books written by the grandmothers and grandfathers of organic farming. And by organic, I really mean more holistic. It was sort of before USDA organic, which is a certification. And their philosophy, people like Lady Balfour and F.H. King and Sir Albert Howard and Rudolf Steiner, have you heard of some of these names? Rodale. Their philosophy was very much that you should farm in a full cycle way and keep all your inputs on the farm. And in fact, you should farm the way nature farms, keeping the ground covered, using local seeds, conserving water, farming with animals, rotating your crops, not plowing your topsoil deep underneath. This was the holistic system, taking all your organic waste and recycling it back into the land so it could then be carbon for the next cycle of planting. And Eric started to do this, and sure enough, his land thrived. His vegetables thrived. They were so delicious. Here he is pulling them out of the soil and eating them right there. So here I am at Jubilee listening to this story by Eric and wondering, wow, in my medical practice, when people come in and they're feeling off and they're not feeling well, and they feel like something's wrong, what do? We test and we replace. And sometimes we replace with pharmaceuticals, or depending on your specialty, you replace with vitamins. But it's all based on this reductionist idea that we, in fact, are test tubes, and that you can stick the stuff in there and it will go to its right place and fix the problem. And so often, I don't see people getting better. Of course, there's a role for pharmaceuticals. There's a role for supplements. I prescribe things like Lipitor that we heard about earlier, along with the best of them. Well, maybe not, but I do prescribe it. But so many times we exist in that gray zone between disease and optimal wellness, and we're seeking something better in terms of our health. And we use this model, this test and replace model, as a way of getting there. And so I asked myself, sitting there at Eric's table and hearing his story, I asked, what happens if I put my patients into these eco-farm cycles, these holistic cycles? What happens to their health? And that really was kind of the question that launched me on to pharmacology. So I'm going to give you 5 lessons that I learned about this in the time remaining, hopefully. And the first one occurred on Jubilee. And the person who, and it's lesson number 1 is what I call farm as vitamin. This is John Reginauld, and he is an agroecologist or agronomist at University of Washington. And he's a very unusual soil science person because he spends a lot of time thinking about human health. Oftentimes, those two worlds, you wouldn't believe how separate they are. You have your nutritionists and doctors and public health workers on one side, and then you have your soil scientists and everybody who's concerned with agriculture on the other. But he thinks a lot about human health. And he did a study. This is his lab. It's 2 strawberry fields in Watsonville, California. And on one side, you had just conventionally farmed strawberries. On the other, he used an organic system, but in fact, it was much more of that holistic system that I showed you. For now, for this moment's purposes, you're going to think that way. And he grew these strawberries, same seed in both fields, and he compared the nutrient quality of both groups of strawberries. And this is what he found. He found that on average, the organic strawberries, the one that were grown in the organic field, had about 9 to 10% more of these different nutritional markers, antioxidants, phenolics, ascorbic acids, than the conventional. Now, first of all, if any of you know anything about food, you're sitting there saying, well, she just talked about reductionism, and now she's just taking these 3 markers and measuring them. And I'm saying, yeah, you're right, because there's probably a lot more other things that we could compare that we don't know how to yet. But just based on these markers, this 10% or so, you might not be so impressed. But think about this over the course of a lifetime of eating those fruits and vegetables, especially for you fruit and vegetable haters out there. You could eat 10% less and get the same bang for your buck. Or think about it if this were a drug. Let's say Roger Newton, one of his investors, was there looking at this. They'd say, wow, 10% more power? 10% more power within this medicine? That's pretty amazing. I'll invest in that. But this isn't something that anybody can hold a patent on, but it's pretty interesting. So next, John Reginauld went back and he said, well, we have other studies that have showed us that organic is better than conventional. What is the secret sauce in there that is truly making the difference? So he did a DNA probe of the soil in both fields. And guess what he found? He found that the field that was organic had way more DNA that was related to microbes in that soil than the conventional soil. So much more microbial activity. The line differentiates the 2 fields, and anything that's to the right of the line is individual microbe DNA that was found in the conventional soil, and stuff that's to the left of the line is organic. There's practically nothing that was in the conventional soil that wasn't in the organic, and there were thousands in the end of forms of microbes that were in the organic. So this is the answer. It's what's going on in the soil, the microbial life of the soil that is feeding us, that is taking the organic matter and passing it on to the roots of the plants and giving us more bang for our buck in terms of our nutrition. These are the unpaid workers. And if you look at farming methods and get even more holistic than organic, which would be something called biodynamic, the little triangle over there all the way on the right, guess what happens? You get more microbes. So the more holistic the farming system, the more microbes, the more nutrients we get. That's the cycle. If you can judge this with your eyes. Can you guys guess which one of these is conventional and which one is biodynamic? Which one's conventional? Come on. What's the left? Biodynamic. How can you tell? Weeds. What else? The soil. It looks alive, doesn't it? In fact, this is how I judge my patients on whether they're healthy or not. It's exactly the same. Well, you're all very smart in here. I didn't know. I know I couldn't come to Louisville. So this is the flow that we have, this nutrient flow, as I discussed, from farm to microbe to soil to people. Now, if you were going to choose your pharmacy based on what I just told you, which one would you pick? The one on the left or the one on the right? Certainly has influenced me in the way that I think about it. Certainly the one on the right, more effective and probably much more delicious. So let's move from there to Missouri. And this is a lesson of farm as immune support. This is Cody Holmes, and he's a beef farmer in Missouri. And he used to be a conventional beef farmer, but for ethical and financial reasons, he now is a holistic beef farmer. He got rid of all the inputs, all the antibiotics, all the growth hormones, all the supplemental feed, everything from his farm, and he lets his grass feed his cattle. He moves them around like the bison used to move in the early 1800s. And by the time they finished moving through all the 7-acre plots on his land, they come back to the grass and it's ready to be eaten again. And Cody has so much free time now that he can sit on Facebook and educate other farmers about how to do this. So here I am visiting Cody Holmes and finding out about his holistic farming system. And he's telling me that since he converted over, not only is he a richer man, but his calves no longer get the diseases that they used to get. And he says their immunity is thanks to all those microbes in the soil. Now, we have heard a lot today about the fact you don't have to be a scientist to do stuff in science. But I still like to check things out with scientists. So I flew to Munich, Germany. And I met with this woman whose name is Erika von Mutius. She's the head of the Allergy and Asthma Research Unit at Munich Children's Hospital. And she has published in all the most prestigious medical journals in the land, including the New England Journal of Medicine. And what she studies is the farm effect. The fact that kids in Bavaria on these sustainable or holistic farms hardly ever get asthma or allergy or eczema or all these diseases that are related to allergy. And I asked Dr. von Mutius, I asked her, what causes this farm effect? And she showed me this picture. Now, what do you see here? Well, first of all, you see two cows that aren't chained up that are sniffing that baby. I don't know, that's a very trusting mom. Or maybe it's just a numbers game, I don't know. But over on the side there, what's in that can? Raw milk. And what's the mom doing? She's throwing hay in the air. Isn't that supposed to make you allergic? Well, that's what's so interesting about this, is that when researchers first started hearing about this farm effect, they all came up with this idea of, well, it's the hygiene hypothesis. This idea that when we're young, if we get exposed to these microbes on the farm, that somehow that tells our immune system to not be reactive to them so we don't get asthma and allergy. Well, that might be part of the explanation. But are there any immunologists in the room? No. Well, here's the situation. Our immune system is not that smart. And the way that our adaptive immune system works is that T lymphocytes kind of belong to two camps, either Th1 or Th2. And the Th2 group is there to react to allergens and also parasites, and Th1 is to react to bacteria and virus. And the thought behind the hygiene hypothesis was if you bombarded these kids with lots of viruses and bacteria, that would down-regulate their response to allergens. Get me? Here's the problem. If you live in a dusty apartment in San Francisco or Louisville, you're exposed to just as many endotoxins as on a farm. They're just more homogeneous. But our T-cell system isn't so good at recognizing diversity versus homogeneity. It's not that smart, so that didn't make sense. But now what we've realized is it isn't our immune system. Guess what it is that's doing this? It's those billions and trillions of bacteria that live in us, our microbiome, who in fact are getting educated by the bacteria and by the diversity of bacteria on the farm. They're really our front men and women who are protecting us. And that's what they're seeing with these farm children. So what's going on these farms is this fascinating microbial DNA swap between microbes in the soil, and Dr. Van Mutius has gone and sampled mattresses from these kids, and they find all these microbes that are from the soil to our microbiome, and then our microbiome in turn is protecting our own DNA. That is the farm effect. And these kids are, through raw milk and through all the different kinds of microbes that the animals are giving them, through all the microbes in the soil, are getting this huge armamentarium of prevention or protection. So this is starting to get studied on a DNA level, this swap between our environment and ourselves. For example, researchers in France have discovered a bacterium that lives on seaweed, and they've been able to code the enzyme within that bacterium that's the part that digests the seaweed. And guess where they found that same sequence of DNA, that enzyme that digests the seaweed? In the microbiome of folks who eat a lot of seaweed. And so what's happened is the bacterium, or at least segments of DNA from that bacterium, have hitchhiked on the seaweed and are now informing the way that seaweed eaters are able to digest their seaweed. It turns out that that kind of transfer of information is probably going on all the time between us and the environments where our food is grown. And if those environments are healthy, we get healthy information. And when those environments are treated with lots of pesticides or antibiotics, then we get antibiotic-resistant information. And there was an article in Science showing that very well recently. So this is the most fascinating part for me, is that as we lose our contact with these diverse environments, these very biodiverse milieus, what's happening is that, in fact, we are getting more and more allergic. Our immune system is losing its teacher. And this is a fascinating graph that was published in the World Allergy Journal showing measures of biodiversity as they go down. And in perfect mirror image, allergic diseases are increasing around the world. We are losing our biodiversity internally and externally. So in terms of immunity, there's the method of farming, the way we treat our soil, directly impacts the microbes, which impact the roots of the plants, which impact us. So once again, choose your pharmacy. Do you want the one on the right or the one on the left? Let's move to the Bronx. This is farm as community medicine. And we're actually in the mid-Bronx, and here we are with Karen Washington, who is an urban farmer. She started a whole network of urban farms and a farmer's market in the mid-Bronx. And she did it because she got sick and tired of looking at these trashed up vacant lots in her neighborhood. She got sick and tired of hearing that farm to table was something for rich people when she knew it was a medicine that a community needed very, very badly. She got sick and tired of having to drive to Lower Manhattan to get something that was not pesticide-treated iceberg lettuce. And so she started these community gardens. And I went up there and I worked with her for a week and with all the members of the community. And my mind was blown. Because I stupidly thought that the reason that urban gardening was so important was because it gave a community more vegetables. But that's only a tiny bit of it. And there's researchers like Jill Litt at the University of Colorado who are starting to quantify this. But it turns out that urban gardening has been linked to all these outcomes. Better health for seniors, lower asthma rates, better school performance in kids, less obesity, less alcoholism, greater collective efficacy, which is the sense as a community that you can make change, less crime, more economic opportunities, better self-rated health. And by the way, do you guys know that self-rated health is probably the best predictor of longevity in health? So if you have a bad opinion of your health, change it right now, okay? So it turns out that many of these communities, they could have been growing tulips and they'd be healthier. And this is part of the mechanism, part of the way that it works. Kids from PS 58 start to come to the farmer's market to get their apple every week, and then they go play in the park. And then the drug dealers in the park say, boy, this isn't a place for us, and they leave. They foot it out of town. And then the people who take care of the park suddenly realize, wow, this park's being used. It's not just a home for drug dealers, and they make the park beautiful. Or maybe this is another mechanism. Would you go out and meet your neighbor if that was outside? Would you go out and exercise? Would you go out and plan a safe routes to school program? No, but how about if that's where you get to have your meeting and meet your neighbor? These are just hypotheses, possible ways that community gardens are doing this. But it doesn't really matter, because what matters is that there's something between the soil and the people. Once again, this health exchange, so that, yes, you do still need to get your medicine at Montefiore Hospital, or at least your pharmaceutical with a pH medicine. But this is another kind of pharmacy that is now being brought into the community, and that we should be funding at the same rate as we're funding the bricks and mortar healthcare, because it makes a tremendous difference. So I've been talking to you about what really direct ways that farming impacts our health. But I'm going to give you, as the last two examples, things that are not so much from the soil to us directly, but are more paradigm shifts, ways that farming can actually change the way that we think about healthcare and think about medicine. So the fourth lesson is farm as a model for cancer care. This is Andrew Mariani. He's actually a young hipster vintner in California, in Sonoma, and he owns Scribe Winery. As you can tell, Andrew's very popular with the ladies. But beyond that, he's actually a really smart guy, or at least he is now. But when he started farming his land, he actually he was a little green behind the ears. And he started to walk around his property and plant his vines. And what he noticed was that there were an awful lot of rattlesnakes there. And so what did he do? He started to kill them. What do you think happened next? His vines started to disappear underground because the rodents, the voles and the mice were eating the roots. And so Andrew said, wow, I am an idiot. And he totally changed the way that he farmed. And he started to think of his land more as an insectary, as a large ecology. And he started to work with agronomists who were thinking about integrated pest management, folks from UC Davis. And really started to think that there were no good guys and bad guys. This was not a war. We should not be having a warrior mentality. We should be thinking about spider mites and lacewings and raspberry bushes. And by the way, the spider mites are typically the enemy. But think of them all as something in balance. Or rattlesnakes, gophers, and owls as something that was a balance. Or weeds and sheep and vine rot. They could keep each other in balance. And so things really shifted, and Scribe thrived as a vineyard. And he also does a lot of intercropping, and he has these riparian ways, and so on. So this is Bob Gattenby, and he is a researcher at Moffitt Cancer Hospital in Tampa. And I think you can tell just by looking at him, he doesn't spend a lot of time on farms. But he's fascinated by farmers. And he has been studying methods like the one Andrew uses. He's been studied integrated pest management. And he said, you know what? We need to change the way we think about cancer. We have that sort of old rattlesnake approach. We go in there and we have to rip it out, nuke it out, poison it out at every cost. And what happens? What happens so often with cancer, especially if it's gone beyond a very localized cancer? Well, the more aggressive cells hang out, and then 5 to 10 years later, they come back with a vengeance. And so often we hear about people who are cured, and then 10 years later, they become sick again and die very rapidly because the cells are, at that point, immune to everything. And Bob Gatenby said, what happens if we start to think of cancer more as an ecology? So there's the cancer cells who really have lost their biodiversity. What happens if we start to think of those healthy cells as something that's just as important to support as it is to attack the cancer cells, and try to find a balance in the field? So he and his colleagues have been studying things called benign cell boosters, things that help affect the pH and the blood flow and the glucose levels of both the cancer cells and the healthy cells, because it turns out that they have very different needs. And he's trying to figure out ways to make those healthy cells thrive as much as he is trying to tamp down the cancer cells. And what he has done is actually he's changing the way, and many of his colleagues are changing the way that we're thinking about cancer, because what he's found is that if he doesn't work so hard on eradicating it, he can actually get at least his lab mice, because a lot of this is still in the lab, he can get them to survive much longer. And this shows you one of his studies with benign cell boosters, and this is in rodents. This is not in humans. It's not ready for prime time yet. But what he showed is that at 11 years of the cancer growth, which is actually typically well before we've actually diagnosed a cancer, that using traditional chemotherapy or this integrated approach gives you about the same kind of outcome. But after 22 years, which is usually in the cell growth cycle of a cancer is about when we detect it clinically, you're starting to see that the black line on the right, the dark black line, is gaining. And by 33 years, which is usually when the cancer's taken over, the integrated approach has actually kept people alive, whereas the typical traditional cancer approach, many more people have died. And I'm talking about rodents at this point, but they're starting to study this in humans. And more cancer therapies are starting to think about this benign cell booster. So the last lesson I want to talk to you about is a farm as a model for stress management. And as a family doctor, I can't think of a health problem that I see more often in my practice than stress. But you know, the funny thing about stress is that sometimes stress is really good for you, right? Sometimes it actually gives you what you need. Like if I weren't a little stressed right now, I'd fall asleep. It's a time change and so on. But on the other side, we know that stress can kill us, right? And also we know there's certain things that can stress-proof us. So this last farm taught me lessons about all these ideas. And it was an egg farm in Arkansas. It was actually 2-in-1. The farmer had started with your farm on the left, which was 15,000 hens in each one of those bunkers with a little bit of really just it's bare ground that they could run on in between. And he fed them organic mash, so that was your free-range organic. Then both, once again, for ethical and financial reasons, he started to convert over to a pastured facility. That's what you see over on the right. This is what it looks like inside. That's me, by the way. That's not a chicken, the one in blue. So I'm standing there, I'm touring these facilities, and I turn to the farmer and I say, wow, I'm standing there in the pastured facility. I said, this is a stress-free nirvana. And those hens over there, they're just stressed to death. And he smiled and he said, you know, kind of. Except these hens in the pastured area, they get attacked by hailstorms, thunderstorms. They still have the tips of their beaks. They take them off in the other facility. So they can attack each other. They have roosts that they can sit on, so they could fall from a roost. There's actually stressors here. They're just different. And that really troubled me. I was like, well, what's the difference then? Why are we so into pasture-raised stuff? So I visited this guy. And his name is Bruce McEwen, and he is one of the world's foremost stress researchers. He's at Rockefeller University in New York. And he studies stress both in chickens and humans. And I asked him, well, you know, what was the difference between these two facilities? And he said, well, in one facility, you've got this low-grade chronic stress. No exercise, it's always dimly lit, loud noises, hard to sleep. So on the other side, you have these episodic stresses that can kind of get your heart going. But then it goes back to something that's quite lovely, where you have this opportunity for sunshine and so on. And he said, those two differences are huge in terms of whether we get sick or not. But then he said, but what those pastured hens have is probably much more important than what they don't have. And it's two things. They have community. Because they're small enough, their groups, they're actually able to make community bonds. And they have choice in their day of what they do. And that those are two things that can really help stress-proof almost anyone, or at least get them a fair amount of the way there. So that, for me, was a huge insight in terms of working with my patients. But what's interesting is when you study the quality, the nutritional quality of the eggs from these two facilities, all of a sudden you realize that everything in agriculture marches out. And in fact, what's good for the hen is good for us. Because you look at things like vitamin E and beta-carotene and lutein and zeaxanthin, they were all much higher in these pastured hens than they were in the free-range organic. And in fact, the free-range organic looks pretty much like conventional. The only difference is the organic mash. And DHA, which is this very important fat for our brains, also much higher in these pastured hens. And what's the most poetic of it all is if you look at all those nutrients, what are they good for? They're good for stress-proofing our own brains. So I just found this over and over again. What's good for our environment, what's good for the farms, what's good for the soil is good for our bodies. We really are all the same system. So how can you identify a holistic farm so that you can become a part of it? Because I hope I've convinced you that it is something that will be good for your health, not in the long term, but in the immediate term, in terms of stress, in terms of immunity, in terms of nutrients, and so on, in terms of community. Well, these ecological or holistic farms, I would say that a fair amount of what's USDA organic is also ecological. But there's also big organic, or label organic, as I call it, which doesn't necessarily follow this ecological model, and really is more of the test and replace model that we learned about at the beginning. And on the other side of things, there's conventional farms where the farmer just can't afford the certifications and is farming in a very ecological or full circle way. So in my opinion, the best way to find out is to ask this one question. Maybe in the 1970s or 1980s, it didn't matter if a farmer lived on the farm, that question didn't matter because there were farming practices that people were doing to their own soil that wasn't that great. But any farmer that's worth his or her salt now and is eating from that land themselves and feeding it to their children and is planning to hand that soil down for generations, they're treating it like a member of their family. And they're going to farm in this ecological way. So that is a wonderful question to ask and find out. And what can you do to join a holistic farm? How can you put your body in this cycle? Well, there's many ways. You can support local farms or buy community-supported agriculture. You can cook, because the minute you start to use raw materials, you can tell if it's good or bad, and you want to get those holistic materials. You can grow your own food, like Karen Washington does. Recycling and composting, giving back to the soil. Even if you live in Louisville, you can do this. San Francisco has a composting program. New York has a composting program. Bring gardens into your community, into elder homes, into schools, into everywhere, because you know now that it is medicine. And get involved with legislation, with the Farm Bill. And most importantly, treat the soil like you treat yourself, and vice versa. Only put things in the soil that you would eat. Only put things on your body or on to wash your house or your car that you're willing to put back into the soil and eat. We are all part of the same cycle. And if you don't believe me, just look at this. Or this. This is the inside of our intestine. Or this. This is through an electron microscope. Can you tell which one is the microbes interacting with the villi in our intestine and which one is the microbes interacting with the roots of the plants? You can't. Because you know what? We are soil. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daphne. If we're to conduct Chris's experiment, I'm going to have to expedite the
I'm so sorry. Yeah,
the question. So I'm just going to ask. I'm going to ask one question. A richer man, said farmer Cody Brown. Now, despite my accent, I actually grew up on a farm in Northern California, and I can tell you the margins in farming are incredibly slim. Farmers practice some of these non-organic methods because it's more effective. It optimizes outcomes. It means they have more predictable crop outputs. Tell me why this vision of farming you think is economically sustainable.
Well, I'm not an agroeconomist, and all I can do is tell you what farmers have told me. But basically, Cody Holmes, who was the beef farmer that I told you about, he had to have an off-farm job in order to support his conventional beef farm. And so many farmers in this country do that. They actually, farming almost turns into more of a hobby, even for these huge farms, because they can't support them. And what Cody did was he started to think outside the box, and he said, what are my huge expenses? He said, it's everything that I'm buying from big pharma. It's the feed for my cows, the hormones, the dewormers, the antibiotics. He said, what happens if I get rid of all that? I own my land. And then as he did that, it took a huge amount of bravery because no one else in the Ozarks at that point was doing that. But what happened was his soil came back to life. He all of a sudden started to have varieties of native grasses there that hadn't been seen in decades. And as we've learned, the more variety and the more microbes that you get, the more nutrition you get. And so he was all of a sudden not buying all these inputs, and his cows were getting healthier, and so he wasn't having the calf loss. And all of a sudden, he went from being in the red to being in the black, and actually being in the super black after a while, to the point where, you know, I'm a family doctor, so I don't make very much money, and I'm a part-time writer. But I can tell you that Cody makes more than I do at this point.
And what about the economics for the consumer? I'm glad you sketched some of the things that ordinary people can do. But a very common criticism of these claims for more organic eating is that if you're a single mother with 2 kids, and you're coming home at the end of a 10-hour day, it is much easier to go and give them some McDonald's. It's cheap, it shuts them up. Why not feed them that?
So there's so many parts to this question. I always love hearing how the audience would answer this too, because I get asked that all the time. But the first part about it is it's not cheaper, right? First of all, even financially, it's not cheaper. And I've shown that many times, that I can make a really healthy meal on, and Mark Bittman does this a fair amount in the Times, you know, with $10 and a bag of beans and a bunch of organic veggies and a little bit of cheese on top so the kids will eat it. And it's amazing what incredible stuff, because McDonald's, even face value, is not that cheap. It's just efficient. But long term, McDonald's is and Burger King and KFC, and I'm sorry, they're a sponsor here, but all of these fast food places, they are costing us a ton, because they are in many ways the source of all the modern chronic diseases that we're seeing in this country. And so when we start to do the new math, which is the right math, of looking at how fast food and convenience food is making it so that we're all ending up on dialysis or with stents in our hearts, things that cost millions and billions of dollars, then we can't even discuss this. It's apples and oranges, you know?
So it's the total cost of our healthcare decisions. We have some questions, please. If you'll stand up at the mic, otherwise we won't be able to hear you, sir, I'm afraid. There's another mic over there. If you haven't spoken earlier in the day, say who you are and where you're from, and though short statements are okay, questions are more polite. Madam.
I wish you would expand on what you were just talking about. I teach a program for low-income women, have for 17 years, and they have 2 generations who haven't cooked. So when we take home ec out of the schools, and people don't know how to cook, this is a big problem. It's not just being on the farm, and it's not just that, but how do you get people to cook?
That's a wonderful question, and there's so many programs that are exactly focused on that. Now, I believe that the way that communities change is from the inside out. That is my personal bias, and that's also what I've seen from traveling around. So it's people like Karen Washington who are, you know, working actually at the after-school program, offering cooking lessons, and also standing there at the farm stand with recipes and saying, okay, you've just bought this bushel of onions, this is what you can do with it, you know. And having conversations that are, not, you know, mother to mother or community member to community member, but also giving recipes that are ethnically appropriate for that community. So that's one piece of it. But in terms of this education, this passing down of knowledge, we are all responsible for that. We're all responsible for, once again, starting to learn some of these basic crafts at the same time as we're talking about computers who are talking to each other and, you know, and all this very exciting stuff. I promise you that a computer is never going to be able to nourish you. And so trying to figure out how we maintain both. And I actually feel like the next generation is realizing that. On a very deep level, you know, this whole DIY movement, it's not just in Brooklyn or in places where people are, you know, wear cool shoes. It's happening across the country. And I was in the Ozarks, and they have a slow food chapter there, and I thought, oh, 3 people are going to show up to this meeting. It was so crowded, I couldn't get in the door. And so, you know, the same thing, I was in, you know, in Arkansas on the Oklahoma border. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but there's not a lot going on there in the foodie movement. And yet, people care about, you know, there was a group of people who really cared about this pasture-based, you know, food and so on. So I feel like times, they are changing, and that we have to support these changes, and we're not the no generation anymore. We're the yes generation, and trying to find solutions.
Let's try and get at least 2 more questions, so ask the question briefly, sir.
I do have a community garden, and I'm really trying to get the community into the garden. I mean, it's a big garden because I have lots of land, and it's a vacant lot, and I was mowing it and picking bottles out of it. So we did a garden, and I feed a lot of people, but they're great harvesters, not so good on the plowing end and the planting end. And that's the vision. That's what I want, and I'm struggling with that.
Well, you know, people come at it in different ways, and I think that part of it is, you know, has to be a sense of ownership. So, you know, in the Bronx, one of the solutions was to let people do whatever they wanted in their plot, where there was just no rules at all. And it was interesting, some people really did just grow tulips. And another rule was that anybody can steal whatever they want. And, pardon? Gleaning. Which I think
was the word.
It's really, really important. There was an elderly man who was gardening while I was there, and 2 teenagers came in and swiped some tomatoes. And he turned to me and he grinned and he said, "That's the best kind of larceny you'll ever see." You know? So,
Daphne, I think we have time for just one more question, please.
Okay. Hi, Doctor. I'm Karen Moskowitz. I'm from Louisville, right here in town. I want to thank you for talking about movements that happen from the inside out. And I see that you have some of our beautiful vegetables and fruit there.
yes,
on
I
your
do. I started to
table.
eat one of them. So
Excellent.
yes,
Right.
thank you. And that's a wonderful thing that's happening out front is the farm, what is it?
Oh, yeah. So this is from the New Roots Fresh Stop project, and you picked that up
Yes,
earlier.
yes.
And we are simulating a fresh stop out in the lobby here in the orange room. This is a community-driven fresh food access project where families who are living in neighborhoods that don't have grocery stores or markets are able to pool their money and their food stamps and buy in case quantities and then be able to share in the abundance throughout the season. So I welcome you all to come out and experience the fresh stop and come out and help us eat the food.
And I just want to add one thing on to that. And I think this is possibly the most important message, is that if you are trying to get people to eat fruits and vegetables, then the wrong way to do it is to hand them something that tastes like a toilet paper roll and say, dig in. I would go to fast food any day. What you need to do is give them the most delicious fruits and vegetables, the ones that are going to convert you, the ones where you're going to see the light. And these are exactly those. I've tested them all, actually, including the carrots. So congratulations.